Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 6th of January of 2025. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the Suja direction, where the Ukrainians, the second day in a row, continue offensive operation in the direction of the settlement by the name of Большое Солдатское. As you can see, we have lots of geolocations, lots of icons that are coming from this area. So this today, the 6th of January, and today is the second day of Ukrainian offensive. Once again, I'll remind you that during the first day of Ukrainian offensive operation, most likely the Ukrainians managed to break through the Russian defense belt to enter the southern part of Berdyan, then to reach the central part of the settlement. In this point, the Ukrainians turned in the eastern direction and began advancing towards the settlement of Novosotnitsky. We don't know for sure whether the Ukrainians managed to take under control or to enter the settlement of Novosotnitsky itself. The only thing we have is the geolocation that was discovered in this point. In the video that was published by the Russian sources, exactly in this point, the Russian FPV drones were attacking Ukrainian units. Based on this video and based on many other videos, we have adjusted the map by the end of the 5th of January in Ukrainian favor. Once again, this is the situation, let's say, by the end of the 4th of January. So all these territories used to be under complete Russian control, and by the end of the 6th of January, all these territories were colored in Ukrainian favor. Different mappers managed to also color it in Ukrainian favor different tree lines and big forest between the settlement of the Berdyan and the settlement of Martinovka. So these territories, you can see, according to neutral mappers, was colored in Ukrainian favor. On the 6th of January, the Ukrainians made another attempt to attack Russian positions, and during the 6th of January, the Ukrainians mainly were focused in their attempts to attack the settlements that were located further to the north. We're talking about Yamskaya Steppe, Novocherkassky, and Razgrebli. So the Ukrainians were trying to enter these three villages and to establish control over them. As for the end of the 6th of January, we don't know for sure whether the Ukrainians managed to take the settlements under complete control or not, but the Russians are saying that today they managed to repel every single attack conducted by the armed forces of Ukraine. Furthermore, according to Russians, by the end of the 6th of January, they managed to secure the settlement of Novosotnitsky and to force the Ukrainians to fall back from the settlement of Berdyan. We have lots of geolocations exactly along this tree line. For example, in this video we can see how the Russians were FPV droning the Ukrainian soldiers along this area. In this video, for example, we can see how the Russians Ka-52 helicopter was attacking Ukrainian vehicles also along the same tree line, trying to destroy as many as possible vehicles that were involved in Ukrainian offensive operation. In this video we can see how another Ukrainian convoy was heading towards those villages we were talking about 5 minutes ago, and how the Ukrainians were ambushed by the Russians and destroyed as a result of mortar fire and FPV drone attacks. In this video we can see several episodes of how the Russians, using fiber optic drones, were attacking and damaging Ukrainian tanks that were heading towards the settlement of Berdyan. We don't know for sure whether those tanks were destroyed or not, but obviously they were damaged. So, and that's it, nothing more. Let's wait for additional updates because it's too early to make any conclusions. Maybe the Ukrainians managed to improve their positions, maybe not. Maybe they, let's say, suppose that they will suffer such losses. But one thing we can say for sure, that obviously the Ukrainians are suffering huge losses trying to attack the settlement of Большое Солдатское. Now let's discuss about the Russians, what the Russians were doing during the previous 24 hours. According to the group of forces north, the Russians carried out several offensive operations. One of them was in the direction of the settlement of Viktorovka. Another offensive operation took place in the direction of Leonidovka and Alexandria. And also the group of forces north stated that as a result of offensive operation, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the settlement of Leonidova. As for the village of Viktorovka, we have some doubts whether the Russians managed to improve their positions. The Ukrainian sources published lots of videos of how the Russians were attacking, and basically the Russians entered the minefield and lots of armored vehicles, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles were destroyed on this minefield. So as you can see, lots of episodes were geolocated exactly in these fields, and we don't know for sure whether the Russians managed to improve their positions or not. But I believe that the Russians maybe tried to attack, but when they suffered first losses, they decided to stop and they returned back towards the settlement of Leonidova with the purpose to attack the settlement of Alexandria. Later, the sources reported that the Russians were trying to attack in the eastern direction, and from these positions the Russians were planning to attack the settlement of Alexandria from behind. But as we can see, that attack failed on the minefields, and the Russians changed their plans and decided to attack the settlement of Leonidova in Alexandria in front. So this is the situation in this area. As for the southern direction, the Russians also continued their offensive operation, and different pro-Russian sources reported that by the end of the 6th of January, as a result of offensive operation, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the settlement of Dmitriykov, Makhnovka. As for the geolocations, by the end of the 6th of January, we haven't received anything that can confirm this. Furthermore, we have several updates from different mappers in Russian favor, and we have video published by the Russian side. In this video, we can see Ukrainians that arrived to the line of combat contact with the purpose to carry out rotation process. In this video, we can see Ukrainians that were replacing one group by another, which means that most likely this territory is under complete Ukrainian control. So this is the situation. The Russians during the day were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions, temporary deployment points, Ukrainian reserves, reinforcement service centers, and today, probably for the first time since the beginning of the battle for the city of Suja, the Russians began using FAB 3000s against the Ukrainian positions. As for this video, we can see the edge positions of the armored forces of Ukraine. We can see lots of Ukrainians that were building and preparing trenches, and then we can see the Russians were attacking these territories with FPV drones. And in this video that was published today, we can see most likely that the Russians, as a result of reconnaissance operation, managed to discover the concentration of Ukrainian forces that the Ukrainians were planning to use further in the direction of Большое Soldatskoye, and the Russians bombed this territory with the use of FAB 3000. So this is the current situation. The Ukrainians are suffering losses. They managed to concentrate critical mass in the territory of Suja, which the Ukrainians were planning to use further in the further offensive operations, but the Russians are bombing everything. Furthermore, and the most important is the statement and the article that was published by Deep State, and according to them, the Russians, before the beginning of this offensive operation, knew for sure where exactly the Ukrainians were planning to attack, in which direction and which time. They indicate the exact location of the assault and almost the exact time. So at least this information appeared in the open source 48 hours before the beginning of this offensive operation, which means that most likely the Russians had the Ukrainian plans probably 2, 3, or even months before. So the Russians were completely ready for this offensive operation, and this is the reason why the Ukrainians were suffering such a heavy losses. Now let's move further, and let's talk about the northern Kupiansk direction. The Russians continued their offensive operation, and according to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions and to take under control additional positions of the armored forces of Ukraine. So these farms were taken by the Russians. So now we see that the Russians are trying to cut the village of Zapadne from supply and support, and most likely very soon the Russians will start offensive operation in the direction of the village by the name of Zapadne. So this is very important, because if the Russians are able to take the settlement under complete control, this is going to be the first settlement taken by the Russians on the Ukrainian side of the river Voskol. We haven't received anything from the settlement of Dvorichno. Most likely there are very heavy clashes. If the Russians are able to take the village of Zapadne under complete control and to force the Ukrainians to fall back, this will lead to the situation that the settlement of Dvorichno would be completely cut from supply and support, and of course then the Russians will face no problems to finish the battle for this area. As for the Kupiansk direction, today the Russian sources published the video how they destroyed another pontoon bridge between western and the eastern banks of the river Voskol, and after another missile strike, the pontoon bridge was destroyed, and obviously during the next several days Ukrainians will suffer some problems with logistics. Now let's move to the southern part of the Kupiansk. According to information we have, the Russians managed to secure the village of Ivanovka completely. I'll remind you that several days ago the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported that the Russians, as a result of clashes, managed to establish complete control over the settlement, but without any geolocations and without any proofs. And after the Russians reported about control over the settlement of Ivanovka, Ukrainians carried out several counterattacks, and there were several videos that confirmed Ukrainian presence on the territory of the village itself. There were tanks attacks, there was very heavy clashes in this area, and we had some doubts whether the Russians indeed managed to take under control the settlement or not. And today, the Russians reported that they finally managed to secure the settlement, to force the Ukrainians to fall back, and now there is no risk to raise the flag and to announce that the village of Ivanovka is under complete Russian control. So as for now, the settlement was taken by the Russians completely, and the Ukrainians were forced to fall back further in the western direction. As for the Sivas direction, during the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything special. Now let's talk about the city of Chasiv Yar, the city of Toretsk, because the most important updates after the battle for Suja is coming from this area. The Russians managed to improve their position significantly in the northern part of the city of Chasiv Yar. At least this was stated by different mappers, by neutral mappers and by pro-Russian mappers. Once again, this is the situation by the end of the 5th of January, and this is the situation by the end of the 6th of January. The Russians took under control this territory, and basically the industrial zone and the citadel of the city of Chasiv Yar was cut from the west and from the northwest, from the mainland. Furthermore, the Russians currently are bombing and attacking the micro-district Novopivnichny, and most likely during the next 48 hours the Russians will try to take under control this micro-district under complete control. And this is going to be the end for the northern part of the city of Chasiv Yar. And there are going to be just several micro-districts in the south, but those micro-districts are located in the lowlands, and the Russian positions are currently located on the elevation, which means that the Russians most likely will face no problems to take the city of Chasiv Yar under complete control, probably by the end of February, or maybe even by the end of January. So anyway, everything is going to become much faster during the next days than we can see right now. And this is very important. We will return to the city of Chasiv Yar in several minutes. Now let's discuss the situation in the city of Toretsk, and as you can see, the Russians managed to establish control over additional blocks, buildings, streets and micro-district, and telling the truth, the city of Toretsk has fallen. According to my understanding of the situation, there are several pockets of resistance, but the situation in Toretsk reminds me the same situation that we used to see in the city of Kurakhove. If you remember, on the 31st of December, the Russians published the first video with the Russian flag on the territory of the power station, but the Russians didn't announce complete control over the settlement on the 31st of December. And just today, on the 6th of January, the Russians announced about complete control over the city of Kurakhove, so 7 days after. So as I understand, the situation in the city of Toretsk is the same. The Russians established complete control. There are several pockets of resistance from Ukrainian side, but most likely within the next 10 days, the Russians will announce complete control over the settlement. Furthermore, as you can see, according to geolocations and according, for example, to this geolocation, we see that the Russians managed to reach the border of the city. So, for example, in this video, the Russian soldier was trying to create a mine barrier on the border of the city of Toretsk. So here he goes with mine in his hands, and the Ukrainian drone was flying above him. This is the moment when the Russian soldiers established mine, and then Ukrainians were trying to destroy the mine because maybe they were planning to counterattack. This episode took place exactly in this area, and as you can see, after this street there are no more buildings, which means that the Russians managed to reach the border of the city. Another episode took place in the northern part. Once again, Ukrainians were after withdrawing the Russians exactly in this point, which means that the Russians reached the border in several parts of the city of Toretsk from the northern side. So once again, the city of Toretsk has fallen most likely. The Russians will try to secure the city itself during the next several days, and after that the Russians will continue offensive operation further. Pro-Russian resources reported that the Russians also managed to improve their positions around the village of Krymskaya and the village of Dachne. Furthermore, neutral mappers reported that the Russians managed to improve their positions as well on the territory of the settlement of Sherbinovka. And summarizing everything, we can make a conclusion that most likely after the Russians finish their regrouping after this very long and difficult battle for the city of Toretsk, the Russians will move further in the northwestern direction with the purpose to get as close as possible and to establish probably physical control over the Kliban Byk water reservoir. So there is a lake, as you can can see, let's add this lake on map, and this water reserve, not lake. This will allow us to understand better the next Russian targets and the Russian goals in this area. So the Russians will try to get this water reservoir, this Kliban-Bytsky water reservoir, and this is going to be something like the beginning of another offensive operation. And main purpose of this offensive operation is to create a cauldron for the armored forces of Ukraine that are currently located in these fields. As you can see, there are lots of villages to the west of New York and Novgorodsk, to the west of Toretsk, like Zarya, Mara Nikolaev, Stara Nikolaevka, Gnatovka, Romanovka, Alexandra Kalinova. And by taking under control over the settlement of Kliban-Byk and Katerinovka, and there is a further water reservoir. This is something like a wall. This is like the eastern wall for this cauldron. Furthermore, according to information we have, during the previous 10 days, the Russians were attacking the Ukrainian positions around the settlement of Vozdvizhenka. Just to remind you that yesterday we have colored the territory in the vicinity of the area, in the village of Yelizavetovka, based on this video. In this video, we can see how the Russians were attacking the settlement of Yelizavetovka from the southeast, and there was very heavy clashes on the territory of the village itself between the Ukrainians and the Russian armored vehicles, and the Russians won that battle. Several Ukrainian tanks were damaged and destroyed. And today we got reports that the Russians continue advancing in the direction of Baranovka and Zelene Polye. Different pro-Russian sources reported that the Russians have already entered the village of Baranovka. Neutral mappers and pro-Ukraine mappers are showing advance in the same direction, but they colored all territories mainly as a contested area or the gray zone. So we see that for the previous 10 days, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly in Yelizavetovka. The Russians managed to take under complete control the village of Vozdvizhenka. Now the Russians are attacking the settlement of Baranovka and the settlement of Zelene Polye, and all these things tell us that most likely the Russians will try to attack further in the direction of the N32 road, and most likely the target of the armored force of Russian Federation is to take under control the settlement of Novoalenovka. So if the Russians are able to take everything inside of this red line, this is going to be another operational encirclement and another cauldron for the armored forces of Ukraine in the fields. So we see that by the end of the battle of the city of Toretsk, the Russians intensified their activity towards the N32 road. And summarizing everything, we can see the beginning of another offensive operation with the purpose first to cut Ukrainian cauldron and then to begin assault operations toward the settlement of Konstantinovka. And by the time the Russians reach this red line, by taking this cauldron and clearing this cauldron, the Russians most likely will finish the battle for the city of Chasiv Yar, and which means that the battle for Konstantinovka will start. And obviously this can happen somewhere by the end of March. According to raw estimation, somewhere by the end of the March, the Russians can begin the offensive operations towards the city of Konstantinovka, or even earlier. Now let's discuss the situation in the Pokrovsk direction. The Russians continue their offensive operation. Currently there are very heavy clashes for the settlement of Zelene. The Russians are attacking this village from the west, and the Russians are attacking the same village from the east. And as you can see, during the previous 24 hours, we have adjusted the map in Russian favor from both flanks, from the western and from the eastern. Most likely the village would be captured by the Russians during the next 48 hours. Furthermore, the Russians continue their offensive operation in the direction of the city of Pokrovsk itself, and today, according to information we have, the Russians, according to pro-Russian sources, the Russians entered the village of Zverova itself. As for different mappers, the Russians just managed to improve their positions around the settlement of Pishane, but the Russians are saying that they are already there. And this is already, let's say, the nearest positions of the armored forces of Ukraine to the city of Pokrovsk itself. Now let's discuss the situation in the Kurakhove direction. We can see lots of icons in this area. The Russians are breaking through the Ukrainian defense belt. There are very heavy clashes. The Ukrainians suffer significant losses. Also today, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation summarized everything during the battle for Kurakhove. The Russians are saying that in total, the armored forces of Ukraine command has concentrated up to 26 battalions with a total strength of over 15,000 troops to hold Kurakhove. As a result of professional actions of the Russian troops, during the Battle of Kurakhove, the armed force of Ukraine lost up to 80% of its personnel, over 12,000 troops, and about 3,000 weapons and military hardware, to include 40 tanks of other armored fighting vehicles. So the Ukrainians suffered significant losses. Basically, the Ukrainians were completely defeated. They lost up to 3 brigades during the battle for this strategical point, and of course the Ukrainians could lose much less if they were maneuvering and retreating and not fighting in a very difficult situation like Kupiansk fortified area. So when talking about the Kurakhove direction, mainly the Ukrainians were always fighting in cauldrons. There was one cauldron, another cauldron, another cauldron. So probably 80% or 80% of time during the battle for the Kurakhove directions, the Ukrainians were located in different micro cauldrons, and this is the reason of such a significant losses. If the Ukrainians were maneuvering and retreating, not allowing the Russians to cut them in cauldrons, of course the losses might be much less, but in this case the line of combat contact could go already somewhere along the Dnipro region, obviously. So the Ukrainians paid significant price to hold the lines, as we can see right now. Furthermore, during the day, the Russians were bombing the settlement of Yantarne, which means that in the very near future we might see the beginning of assault operation in this direction. Furthermore, the Russians, another day in a row, are bombing and attacking the settlement of Dachne. They started bombing this territory several days ago, but as we can see, as for now, without any changes on the ground and without any assault operations. Furthermore, the Russians control completely the territory with FPV drones. Everything is in the complete fire, so the Russians control the situation in this pocket for 100%. And now we see the same story. Well, let's continue with these cauldrons. The Ukrainians haven't managed to abandon their positions, to escape the Kurakhove cauldron, because there is another pocket, as we can see, and now the Russians are trying to create another one. Now the Russians are trying to advance in the direction of Andreevka, and they are trying to create another pocket for the Ukrainians, while the Ukrainians are still in the previous pocket. So this is very difficult situation. The Ukrainians can't stabilize the situation, and the thing is that they escaping one pocket, one cauldron, suffering significant losses, and they're escaping one operational encirclement towards another operational encirclement. And if this situation continue the same way with these tactics, the Russians can reach the river of Dnipro very fast by making one cauldron after another. Furthermore, the Russians are preparing themselves before the beginning of the offensive operation in the direction of Rozliv. This territory is also under very heavy fire from the Russian side, so we are waiting that from one day to another the Russians will begin this offensive, this assault operation. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.